Eye gouging, the blinding technique. Eye gouging is exactly what it sounds like, jamming your fingers into your opponent's eye sockets with the intent to blind them. In early UFC fights, this was happening regularly. Fighters would grab their opponent's head and just start digging their thumbs into their eye sockets like they were trying to scoop out ice cream. The technique is devastatingly effective because the human eye is incredibly fragile. Just 15 pounds of pressure can cause permanent damage. A trained fighter applying full force, they can literally pop an eyeball like a grape. Here's the science behind it. Your eyeball sits in a socket surrounded by soft tissue. When someone applies pressure directly to the eye, they're not just risking surface damage. They can detach the retina, rupture blood vessels, and cause permanent blindness. The most infamous incident happened at UFC 4, when Keith Hackney fought Joe Son. During a ground exchange, Hackney grabbed Son's head and started pressing his thumbs into Son's eye sockets. The referee had to physically pry Hackney's fingers away from Son's face. Son suffered corneal damage that affected his vision for months afterward. But here's what's crazy. Eye gouging was so common in early MMA that some fighters would actually trim their fingernails into points before fights. They were literally weaponizing their hands. By the way, this is why modern UFC gloves have that specific finger design. They're engineered to prevent accidental eye pokes, but early fighters found ways around every safety measure. Fish hooking, the flesh ripper. Fish hooking involves inserting your fingers into your opponent's mouth, nose, or any facial opening and pulling with maximum force. The goal? Tear the flesh and cause excruciating pain that forces an immediate submission. Imagine someone jamming their fingers into the corners of your mouth and pulling in opposite directions with the strength of a professional athlete. The human mouth can tear surprisingly easily. We're talking about soft tissue that's not designed to handle that kind of stress. The technique gets its name from fishing, where you hook a fish's mouth and pull. Except in this case, you're trying to rip apart another human being's face. At UFC 3, Harold Howard fish-hooked Royce Gracie so aggressively during their fight that Gracie's mouth was bleeding for the rest of the match. Howard inserted his fingers into Gracie's mouth and pulled until the skin started tearing. The crowd went silent. Even they knew this crossed the line. Fish hooking the nose is even more dangerous. The nasal cavity is connected to your sinuses and brain cavity. Aggressive fish hooking can cause severe bleeding, broken nasal bones, and in extreme cases, brain fluid leakage. Neck cranks, the paralysis maker. Neck cranks involve grabbing your opponent's head and twisting or pulling it in ways the human neck isn't designed to move. Unlike chokes, which cut off blood flow or air supply, neck cranks attack the cervical spine directly. The danger here is immediate and permanent. The human neck contains the spinal cord. Damage it and you're looking at paralysis from the neck down. In the worst cases, severe neck cranks can cause instant death by severing the spinal cord completely. Your spinal cord is basically your body's main electrical cable. It carries all the signals from your brain to the rest of your body. Damage it, and those signals can't get through. That's why neck injuries are so terrifying. They don't just affect one part of your body, they can shut down everything below the injury point. At an early Vale Tudo event in Brazil, Rickson Gracie applied a neck crank so aggressively that his opponent suffered herniated discs and nerve damage. The fighter had to retire permanently after the match, left with chronic pain and limited mobility in his arms. The most dangerous neck crank is called the can opener. You get behind your opponent, lock your hands under their chin, and pull their head backward while driving your knee into their spine. The leverage you can generate is enormous, and the potential for catastrophic injury is real. What makes neck cranks particularly insidious is that they often cause damage before the victim can tap out. Unlike a choke where you have several seconds of consciousness to submit, a neck crank can cause permanent damage in milliseconds. Limb and joint destroyers. These techniques target the smaller, more vulnerable parts of your opponent's body with surgical precision. Small joint manipulation, the career ender. Small joint manipulation involves attacking fingers, toes, and wrists. Joints that aren't designed to handle the kind of torque a trained fighter can apply. Picture someone grabbing your pinky finger and bending it backward until it snaps. That's small joint manipulation. It's banned because these joints are incredibly vulnerable, and the damage is often permanent. dominant. Your fingers contain 14 bones each, connected by tiny ligaments and tendons. These joints are designed for fine motor control, not for resisting the full strength of a professional athlete trying to break them. Remember that technique I mentioned that ended a career in 3 seconds? It happened at UFC 12 during a grappling exchange between Vitor Belfort and Scott Ferozzo. Ferozzo grabbed Belfort's index finger during a scramble and bent it so far backward that it snapped instantly. The sound was audible throughout the arena, a sharp crack followed by Belfort's scream. The fight was stopped immediately, and Belfort's finger was bent at a 90-degree angle. Despite multiple surgeries, he never regained full use of that finger, and it affected his grappling for the rest of his career. Broken fingers might not sound that serious compared to some of the other techniques we've discussed, but for a professional fighter, it can end their career. Your hands are your tools. Damage them severely enough and you can't compete at the highest level anymore. The technique was particularly common in early Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitions, where fighters would attack fingers to break grips and force submissions. Royce Gracie was notorious for this. He would grab individual fingers and just start twisting until his opponents released their grips. Headbutting, the skull weapon. Before headbutts were banned, fighters were essentially using their skulls as weapons. And here's something that'll blow your mind: the human skull is incredibly hard, harder than most people realize. When you drive it into someone's face with the full force of your neck and shoulders behind it, you're looking at instant knockouts and severe facial fractures. The frontal bone of your skull, that's your forehead, is one of the hardest bones in your body. It's designed to protect your brain from impact. When you weaponize it against someone's face, which is made up of much more fragile bones, the results are devastating. Mark Coleman was notorious for his headbutts at UFC 10 and 11. He would grab opponents in the clinch and just start driving his forehead into their face repeatedly. His headbutts were so powerful, they would often end fights immediately. The move that finally got headbutts banned? Coleman delivered such a vicious headbutt against Don Frye at UFC 10 that it broke Frye's nose in 3 places, shattered his orbital bone, and caused a concussion so severe that Frye couldn't remember the fight for weeks afterward. The sound of the impact was so loud, it was picked up by the arena microphone. Heel hooks and knee destruction, the silent killer. While heel hooks aren't completely banned in the UFC, they're heavily regulated because of their potential to cause catastrophic knee damage. A heel hook involves controlling your opponent's leg and twisting their foot while their knee is trapped. The human knee is a complex joint with multiple ligaments: ACL, MCL, PCL, and meniscus. A properly applied heel hook can tear all of them simultaneously. We're talking about injuries that require multiple surgeries and years of rehabilitation. Here's what makes heel hooks so dangerous. They often cause damage before you feel pain. Unlike other submissions where the pain builds gradually, heel hooks can destroy your knee before your brain even registers that you're in danger. The most devastating heel hook incident in MMA history happened to Frank Mir at an ADCC competition. Dean Lister caught Mir in a heel hook and cranked it so fast that Mir's knee was completely destroyed before he could tap. The injury was so severe that Mir needed 3 separate surgeries and was never able to compete in grappling again. One second his knee was fine, the next second it was completely destroyed. By the way, this is why you'll notice UFC fighters are extremely cautious when someone goes for their legs. They know that one wrong move can end their career instantly. Dean Lister was notorious for his heel hooks in early MMA. He would get the position and just start cranking until something gave way. His opponents knew that once Lister got their leg, they had seconds to escape or their knee was gone. Spinal and neck killers. Now we're getting into techniques that don't just hurt, they can paralyze or kill instantly. Pile driver spiking techniques. The spine snapper. The pile driver is a wrestling move where you lift your opponent upside down and drive their head into the ground. In MMA, this translates to picking up your opponent and spiking them headfirst into the canvas with the full force of gravity and your body weight behind it. Here's why this is so terrifying. The human neck has 7 vertebrae, and they're not designed to handle the full weight of a human body being driven downward at high speed. When you spike someone on their head, you're essentially trying to compress their entire entire spine into their skull. The cervical spine, that's your neck, is particularly vulnerable because it's the most mobile part of your spine. It's designed for flexibility, not for absorbing massive downward impacts. The most terrifying incident happened at UFC 7 when Marco Ruas attempted a slam defense against Paul Varelans that went horribly wrong. Varelans lifted Ruas up for what should have been a standard takedown, but whether intentionally or not, drove him straight down onto his head. The sound of the impact was audible throughout the arena, a sickening crack that made everyone go silent. Ruas was unconscious before he hit the ground and had to be carried out on a stretcher. Medical experts later said that if the angle had been just slightly different, it could have resulted in permanent paralysis or death. What makes pile drivers so dangerous is that there's no way to defend against them once you're in the air. You're completely at your opponent's mercy, and if they decide to spike you, there's nothing you can do to protect yourself. The early UFC nightmare. Picture this. November 12th, 1993. UFC 1, Denver, Colorado. No weight classes, no time limits, and most importantly, almost no rules. The only things you couldn't do were bite and eye gouge. Everything else? Fair game. What happened next was a bloodbath that made gladiator fights look like pillow fights. Fighters were throwing headbutts that would make a ram jealous. They were fish-hooking opponents' mouths until they tore. They were dropping 12 to 6 elbows that could crack skulls like eggs. And the crowd? They loved every second of it. But here's the thing, the UFC quickly realized they had a problem. This wasn't sport, this was legalized assault with a pay-per-view audience. Insurance companies were backing out faster than you could say liability. Athletic commissions were threatening complete bans. Politicians were calling it human cockfighting. And fighters? They were getting injured so badly that some never fought again. Gerard Gordeau at UFC 1 threw a punch so hard it broke Tila Tuli's teeth. Tuli's tooth actually flew out of his mouth and landed in the front row. The fight lasted 26 seconds, but the dental surgery took 6 hours. By the way, Tuli was a 400-pound sumo wrestler who had never been knocked down in his life. One punch from Gordeau changed everything. That's when everyone realized something had to change. The unified rules of mixed martial arts were born out of necessity, and with them came a list of techniques so dangerous, so potentially lethal, that using them would get you immediately disqualified and possibly arrested. Now, what I'm about to show you isn't just a list of banned moves. These are techniques that were developed over centuries of warfare, refined in back alley fights, and perfected by people whose only goal was to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. Some of these moves can cause permanent blindness, others can snap your spine, and a few, they can kill you in seconds. 12-6 elbow strikes. The skull cracker. The 12 to 6 elbow is thrown straight down, like you're looking at a clock and going from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. It's banned because of the devastating power you can generate when you're dropping your entire body weight behind your elbow. Think about it. Your elbow is one of the hardest, sharpest bones in your body. It's literally a pointed weapon attached to your arm. When you drive it straight down with gravity helping you, you're creating a weapon that can crack skulls, break ribs, and cause internal bleeding. The technique became notorious after several fighters suffered severe cuts and concussions from 12 to 6 elbows. The elbow creates what's called a splitting force. Instead of the blunt trauma you get from a punch, the elbow concentrates all that force into a tiny point, which can literally split skin and bone. Here's what's controversial about the 12 to 6 elbow ban. Many fighters and experts argue that it's not significantly more dangerous than regular elbows. John Jones famously lost to Matt Hamill by disqualification for throwing 12 to 6 elbows, and he still argues the rule is outdated. But the UFC maintains the ban because of the visual impact. A 12 to 6 elbow looks more brutal than other strikes, and in a sport that's constantly fighting for mainstream acceptance, optics matter. By the way, this is the illegal technique that's still debated today. Some states are actually considering removing the 12 to 6 elbow ban, arguing that it's no more dangerous than horizontal elbows. Techniques that cause permanent damage. What makes these limb attacks so insidious is that they often cause damage faster than a fighter can submit. Unlike a choke, where you have several seconds to tap out before losing consciousness, joint manipulation can cause permanent damage in milliseconds. The psychological impact is just as severe as the physical damage. Many fighters develop a fear of grappling after suffering these injuries. They become hesitant to engage on the ground, which fundamentally changes their fighting style and often ends their careers prematurely. Frank Mir was famous for his brutal submissions in the UFC. His armbar against Tim Sylvia at UFC 48 was so vicious that you could hear Sylvia's arm break on the broadcast. The sound was so disturbing that the UFC started muting the audio during replays. Unsportsmanlike and brutal tactics. Now we get into the techniques that aren't just dangerous, they're downright savage. Biting and spitting, the disease spreaders. Biting in a fight isn't just unsportsmanlike. It's a disease transmission risk and can cause severe tissue damage. Human bites are actually more dangerous than many animal bites because of the bacteria in our mouths. Your mouth contains over 700 different types of bacteria. When you bite someone and break the skin, you're essentially injecting all of that bacteria directly into their bloodstream. The infection risk is enormous. Here's the move that made Dana White personally ban it with zero tolerance. At UFC 8, Gary Goodridge bit Paul Herrera's ear during a clinch exchange. But this wasn't just a quick bite. Goodridge clamped down and wouldn't let go. Security had to physically pry his jaw open to get him to release Herrera's ear. The bite was so severe that it tore off a piece of cartilage and required plastic surgery to repair the damage. Dana White witnessed this firsthand and was so disgusted that he immediately implemented a lifetime ban for any fighter caught biting. No warnings, no second chances, bite someone and you're done forever. Mike Tyson's ear bite against Evander Holyfield in boxing showed the world just how devastating biting can be in combat sports. Tyson literally bit off a piece of Holyfield's ear and spat it onto the canvas. The image of Holyfield's mangled ear became one of the most shocking moments in combat sports history. Spitting is banned for obvious health reasons, but it's also a psychological weapon designed to humiliate and enrage your opponent. In early MMA, fighters would spit blood, saliva, or worse at their opponents to try to break their mental focus. Groin attacks and low blows, the instant incapacitators. Groin strikes are banned because they can cause serious internal damage and serve no legitimate sporting purpose. A well-placed groin strike can rupture testicles, cause internal bleeding, and lead to long-term fertility issues. The male groin is essentially a collection of extremely sensitive organs hanging outside the body with minimal protection. When you strike this area with the force of a trained fighter, you're looking at injuries that can require emergency surgery. At UFC 4, Keith Hackney threw a devastating groin strike against Joe Sun that left Sun writhing on the ground for several minutes. The strike was so severe that Sun was hospitalized with internal injuries and required emergency surgery. The fighter was never able to have children naturally due to the damage. By the way, this incident led to the immediate implementation of protective cups as mandatory equipment. Before this, fighters could choose whether or not to wear protection. What makes groin strikes particularly insidious is that they can incapacitate even the toughest fighters instantly. Pain tolerance doesn't matter when someone crushes your testicles. You're going down regardless of how tough you think you are. Hair pulling and clothing manipulation, the dirty tactics. Hair pulling might seem minor compared to the other techniques we've discussed, but it can cause serious neck injuries and scalp damage. When you grab someone's hair and yank their head around, you're putting tremendous stress on their cervical spine. The human scalp is attached to the skull by a thin layer of tissue. Aggressive hair pulling can literally tear the scalp away from the skull, causing severe bleeding and permanent scarring. The most dangerous hair pulling incident occurred at UFC 5 when Oleg Taktarov grabbed his opponent's hair during a takedown attempt. The sudden jerk caused severe neck strain and a concussion when the fighter's head snapped back violently. The fighter suffered whiplash so severe that he couldn't turn his head for months. In women's MMA, hair pulling was particularly problematic before stricter rules were implemented. Female fighters would grab their opponent's hair and use it to control their head position, often causing severe scalp injuries and bald patches that never grew back. Strikes to the back of the head, the brain scrambler. Strikes to the back of the head and neck are banned because they target the brainstem, the part of your brain that controls vital functions like breathing and heart rate. A hard strike to this area can cause instant death or permanent brain damage. The back of the skull is thinner than the front, and the brainstem sits right underneath it with minimal protection. When you strike this area, you're essentially attacking the most vulnerable part of the human nervous system. At UFC 13, Tito Ortiz landed several strikes to the back of Guy Mezger's head during a ground exchange. Mezger suffered a severe concussion and temporary memory loss. He couldn't remember his own name for 20 minutes after the fight ended. By the way, this is why you'll see referees constantly warning fighters about their hand placement during ground exchanges. One misplaced punch can cause catastrophic damage. Modern implications, and what happens when rules are broken. So how have these rules shaped modern MMA? The banned techniques list has essentially forced fighters to become more technical and creative. Instead of relying on brute force and dirty tactics, modern fighters have to develop sophisticated skills in striking, grappling, and submissions. But what happens when someone breaks these rules today? The consequences are severe: immediate disqualification, potential suspension, fines that can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in some cases, criminal charges. The UFC takes these rules seriously because they know that one serious injury from a banned technique could destroy the sport's reputation and legitimacy. Jon Jones has been involved in multiple eye poke controversies throughout his career. His long reach and extended fingers have caused eye injuries to Daniel Cormier, Alexander Gustafsson, and Stipe Miocic. Each incident resulted in point deductions and rule changes about how fighters must position their hands. The most controversial recent incident involved Jon Jones throwing what appeared to be a 12-6 elbow against Matt Hamill at UFC The Ultimate Finale. The referee stopped the fight and disqualified Jones, the only loss on his record. Video review confirmed the illegal technique, and Jones faced suspension and fines totaling $50,000. The debate continues. Here's what's interesting. Some fighters and fans argue that certain banned techniques should be allowed. They claim that techniques like 12-6 elbows aren't significantly more dangerous than regular elbows, and that the ban is based on outdated thinking. Others argue that the rules don't go far enough. They point to the long-term brain damage that fighters suffer from repeated head trauma and suggest that more striking techniques should be banned to protect athletes' safety. Modern safety measures. Today's UFC is almost unrecognizable compared to the early days. We have comprehensive medical testing, ringside physicians, immediate medical attention, and strict oversight from athletic commissions. Fighters undergo extensive medical examinations before and after fights. Brain scans, blood tests, and physical examinations are mandatory. If a fighter shows any signs of serious injury, they're immediately suspended until they can prove they're medically cleared to compete. The UFC has also implemented new safety protocols, including better referee training, improved medical equipment at events, and stricter enforcement of existing rules. The bottom line: the UFC has evolved from a no-holds-barred spectacle into a legitimate sport with proper safety protocols, medical oversight, and athlete protection. The banned techniques list is a big part of that evolution. But make no mistake, even with all of these rules, MMA remains one of the most dangerous sports in the world. The techniques that are still legal can cause serious injury and long-term damage. The banned techniques we've discussed today, they're banned for a reason. These rules exist because real people suffered real injuries. Careers were ended, lives were changed, and in some cases, fighters were permanently disabled by these techniques. The next time you watch a UFC fight, remember that what you're seeing is actually a highly regulated, safety-conscious version of what combat sports can be. The early days were truly brutal, and the banned techniques we've covered today are a reminder of just how dangerous fighting can be when there are no rules. If you found this breakdown fascinating and want to understand more about how the UFC actually works, hit that subscribe button if you want more UFC breakdowns like this. And remember, these techniques are banned for a reason. Let me know in the comments which banned move shocked you the most so far.